A homily by Deacon Mike Symons for Daily Mass, 24 November 2023. In the Gospel today, the Jewish leaders of the temple were looking for an opportunity to arrest Jesus away from the crowds who were hanging on his every word. So when Jesus drove out the merchants who were making the temple into a marketplace, it really infuriated them. They wanted Jesus dead. And soon after, Jesus was arrested at night in secret and gave up his life on the cross as the King of Martyrs for our salvation. And ever since, and throughout the history of the church, it has been a dangerous thing to be a follower of Jesus. For example, in 1820 and thereafter till around 1862, a severe persecution was waged against Christians in Vietnam, when at least 130,000 and possibly as many as 300,000 Catholics were martyred. Today we honor all of them, known and unknown, with a particular focus on the 117 martyrs who were canonized in 1988 during the pontificate of St. John Paul II. These martyrs included 50 priests, 8 bishops, and 59 lay people of French, Spanish, and Vietnamese descent, with the most venerated of them being St. Andrew Dung, a Vietnamese priest. Among many persecutions, Andrew was imprisoned, but his congregation bought his freedom, and he resumed his ministerial duties even in the face of threats and more persecution. Then, when he attempted to visit another priest in secret for confession, both were imprisoned, but later they were also freed in exchange for money raised by local Catholics. They both returned to their ministerial duties as priests for a few more years under constant threat, but then were rearrested and taken to Hanoi, where they suffered dreadful torture and martyrdom by beheading, which was one of the more merciful ways that Catholics were being killed at that time, as many others were dismembered, others suffocated, and some burned alive. Most of them were branded with special characters on their face, which stood for false religion, prior to their execution, when they refused to step on a crucifix and renounce their Catholic faith. That kind of faith in the face of some of the worst persecutions of Christians in the world took unyielding courage. But we shouldn't think that being Christian today is any less dangerous than it was 200 years ago, because there have been more Christian martyrs in the last 100 years around the world than in the previous 2,000 years of the church's history combined. So statistically, that means Catholics in some places around the world have a greater chance of being persecuted and martyred today than in any other time in the church's history. This feast of so many martyrs that we celebrate today should cause each of us to ask the question of ourselves whether we have the faith and courage to join them if we are faced with martyrdom ourselves. I know a story of a teenage girl and devout Catholic named Valine who turned out to have that kind of faith and courage. When on a normal day she was studying in the library with some of her friends, suddenly they heard gunfire and screams. They all got under the tables as Valine whispered prayers until suddenly she was hit by a shotgun blast that knocked her across the floor. And as she laid there bleeding with 34 pellets in her torso and arms, Valine whispered more loudly, oh my God, help me, God," while the shooter stood over her and reloaded his gun. Then he pointed the gun directly at her and asked, "Do you believe in God?" Valine, who was struggling to breathe, said, "Yes." And the shooter asked, "Why?" And she answered, "Because I believe, and my parents brought me up that way." And with that, the young man lowered his gun and walked away. Valine survived that terrible day in 1999 at Columbine High School, and later, when eyewitnesses revealed the details of her close encounter with death, she was asked about her bravery. She said, "I don't think of it as bravery. He asked me if I believed in God, and I couldn't say no. I said what I said because it's true." Valine, when faced with almost certain death, turned to God first, and when asked the question why, she witnessed to her faith and her Catholic upbringing that prepared her to accept life or death according to God's will. Later she said, "Being so close to death, you live every day as if it's your last. God could call at any time, and all we can hope is that we'll be ready." Valine was ready to die for Christ, but instead she lived for him. Unfortunately, most people focus their time and efforts in this world restlessly seeking entertainment and pleasure, money, power, or control during this short time we have here, instead of seeking holiness. But even if we live to be 100, that's just a blip compared to eternity. But it is that blip of time that determines where we go for eternity. And isn't it amazing how so many people, even Christians, don't think very much about eternity, as if they believe somehow that everyone except maybe Hitler gets to go to heaven. And actually, they aren't wrong. Everyone will go to heaven, at least on Judgment Day, but not everyone will get to stay. But for those who are ready to meet their Maker by following Christ, living for Christ, and even dying for Christ, eye has not seen or ear heard, or has it ever entered into the mind of man what God has ready in heaven for those who love him. My brothers and sisters, from the example of the martyrs we honor today and the faith of a teenage girl named Valine, we can know that Jesus is worth living for because heaven is worth dying for. St. Andrew Dung, priest and companion martyrs, pray for us.